If you're listening by candlelight or city light, leave a note of which city you're hearing this from. If these old names and older warnings are worth keeping alive, subscribe and let the chronicle continue. Netheril did not begin as a villain's empire, no matter how the ruins try to convince you otherwise. In the earliest accounts, it was hunger and brilliance braided together. Survivors of hard land learning to command forces that other peoples still feared to name. Magic, for them, was not ornament. It was infrastructure. It kept caravans alive. It kept borders steady. It kept the night at bay. And then Netheril learned to fly. The floating enclaves were not merely feats of engineering. They were declarations. Stone and city lifted above the world's reach, where storms could be watched from above and armies could be ignored entirely. The arcanists who ruled from those heights, archwizards whose spellcasting had crossed from mastery into assumption, began to think of gravity the way common folk think of weather, a thing that happens to other people. That confidence had a source deeper than arrogance. Netheril's high magic was rooted in a cosmic structure that most mortals never perceive directly. The weave, the ordered lattice through which spells are shaped and made safe. In those days, the weave was guided by Mistral, and the Empire's greatest mages treated that guidance as an invisible guarantee. They could push further and further still, because the world itself, through Mistral, made their pushing possible. But a civilization built on limitless ascent eventually faces a simple problem. The sky has no ceiling, yet power always does. In the later centuries, Netheril's rivals multiplied, its resources strained, and its internal politics sharpened into knives. The enclaves floated higher, but the Empire's anxieties rose with them. There were threats below, hostile realms, ancient monsters, the slow grind of scarcity, and threats within. Ambitious arcanists competing not for survival, but for permanence. In that climate, the idea that Netheril might one day fall was intolerable. One archwizard refused to accept it. Karsus of Eilinar enters the record like a bright blade drawn in a dark room. He was young by the standards of his peers, but that only made his reputation sharper. He was known as a prodigy of transformative magic, a mind that could see patterns others missed and then force those patterns to obey. Netheril produced many geniuses. Karsus was the kind that made other geniuses uneasy. Because he did not ask what magic should do. He asked what magic could be made to do. In the surviving lore, you can feel the narrowing of his attention over time. He watched Netheril's leadership, archwizards who had become princes of the air, argue and posture while the Empire's problems thickened. He watched the enclaves become both refuge and cage, and he reached a conclusion as clean as a spell diagram. If the world could threaten Netheril, then Netheril needed power that the world itself could not resist. Not another Mythalar, not another floating city, not another ward. Something above the reach of kings, enemies, and even time. The gods were the obvious answer, and that should have ended the conversation. Gods are not merely powerful beings in Faerun, they are the custodians of principles, war, death, knowledge, nature, magic itself. They are stitched into reality. To challenge one is to tug at the seams. Karsus did not treat that as a warning. He treated it as a design constraint. Netheril possessed a tradition of epic magic. Spellcraft so immense, it required resources, cooperation, and calculation beyond what later ages would consider sane. Epic magic was not the casual casting of a single wizard at a tower window. It was architecture made of symbols, power sources, and time. It was the difference between lighting a fire and changing the shape of a continent's destiny. Karsus turned that tradition toward a single, terrible purpose. He began to craft an epic spell that would do what no mortal rite had ever been meant to do: seize the divinity of a god, to steal the mantle itself and wear it. In the annals, it is named simply and chillingly Karsus's avatar. Not a prayer, not a bargain. An act of magical substitution, as if divinity were a cloak that could be pulled from one set of shoulders and thrown over another. There is a reason even the most ambitious arcanists hesitated at the threshold Karsus crossed. A mortal mind, no matter how brilliant, is shaped for mortal limits. Gods are not. Yet Karsus pressed forward because the Empire's needs, his Empire's needs as he understood them, seemed to demand the impossible. He was not the first wizard to covet divine power, but he may be the most important because he did not covet it as fantasy. He engineered it as procedure, and procedure requires a target. In any sober telling, the choice of which god to strike should have been the final barrier. Most deities would annihilate a mortal who tried to touch their essence. Others might twist the attempt into a catastrophe of a different kind. But Karsus's spell was not designed to survive the god's response. It was designed to replace the god in that instant, to occupy the seat before the seat could throw him out. So he needed a god whose seat mattered most. He chose Mistral. Not because she was weak, no god of magic can be called weak, but because she was fundamental. Mistral did not merely use magic. She was the divine steward through whom magic remained ordered and accessible. The weave, as mortals knew it, depended on her. To Karsus, that dependence looked like leverage. If he could take Mistral's divinity, he would not simply become another god among many. He would become, for however long the spell held, the living axis on which all spellcasting turned. He could rewrite magic's laws. He could seal Netheral's supremacy into the structure of reality. He could make an empire that never fell, because the very thing that could topple it would be controlled by him. The horror of this plan is not its malice, it is its clarity. In the final preparations, the chronicles speak of Netheral at its height. Cities suspended like gemstones in the sky, arch-wizards entrenched in their own rivalries, and one man assembling a spell too vast for any single life to hold. The Empire did not rally to stop him. Either they did not understand, or they believed genius would once again spare them from consequence. That is how hubris survives. Not as a roar, but as an assumption shared by everyone who benefits from the risk. When Karsus finally cast Karsus's avatar, the world did not tremble with drama. It failed with simplicity. For a moment, brief enough to be counted in heartbeats, Karsus succeeded. The spell struck Mistral, and her divinity surged into a mortal vessel. The greatest wizard of Netheral held the mantle of the goddess of magic. And then the weave began to die in his hands, because what Karsus had taken was not a crown or a title. It was a function, an endless, living responsibility that required a divine consciousness to maintain. The weave was not a spell to be cast. It was the condition that made spells possible. To guide it required understanding every strand, every interaction, every limit, and doing so simultaneously, across a world where countless minds were shaping magic at once. Karsus's mind, brilliant, mortal, singular, could not contain it. In that instant, magic across Faerun faltered, not weakened, not misfired. It simply stopped behaving like an ordered art. The greatest workings collapsed first, because they relied most heavily on stable structure. Mythalars, the engines that kept enclaves aloft, depended on rules that were now unraveling. The sky began to fall, and Mistral, torn from her role and facing a greater disaster than her own death, made the choice that defines her place in history. She severed the weave to prevent Karsus from corrupting it completely, to prevent reality's magical foundation from being twisted into something irreparable. That severing killed her. A god died, not because a mortal's spell overpowered her in battle, but because she chose annihilation over allowing magic itself to become a mortal's captive instrument. In the language of consequences, it was a sacrifice. In the language of Netheril, it was the end of everything they had built. With the weave cut, Netheril's high magic failed everywhere at once. The enclaves, those cities that had mocked the earth for centuries, lost the force holding them aloft. They plunged. Stone towers broke like bone against the ground. Whole populations vanished in seconds beneath collapsing architecture and the fury of impact. This was Karsus's folly, the catastrophe so complete it became a moral law. And in the ash of that fall, one truth remained, heavy and unmistakable. The spell had worked well enough to kill a god, but not well enough to let a mortal live as one. In the wreckage of Netheril, the survivors did not first speak of Karsus with anger. They spoke of him with the stunned caution reserved for natural disasters, something too large to fit inside ordinary blame. Across the lands where Netheril's shadow had once been felt, the signs were immediate and brutal. Whole regions that had depended on enclave trade and protection were suddenly exposed. Roads became dangerous again. Borders, once held by wizard law and airborne intimidation, collapsed into old rivalries and new opportunists. And beneath it all lay a quieter terror. For a short span, magic itself had proved mortal. People who had never cared about archwizards or enclaves felt it in the most intimate ways. A healing prayer that failed, a ward that did not hold, a charm that sputtered into nothing. The learned understood the cause only in fragments, but fear does not need scholarship to spread. It only needs memory. Within the shattered enclaves, those that did not simply vanish into craters, Netherese relics became curses as often as treasures. Spellbooks lay under broken stone like drowned scripture. Mythalar fragments and enchanted devices, no longer anchored to stable laws, were dangerous even to touch. The greatest works of the empire had not merely been smashed, they had been robbed of the invisible order that made them predictable. That order began to return, but it returned changed. Mestral's death did not leave the world permanently unmade. Faerun could not remain without a steward for magic. Not for long, because too many systems, mortal, monstrous, and divine, were entangled with spellcraft. In the lore that followed, Maestral's essence reformed as Maestra, a new goddess of magic born from the necessity Mistral had died to protect. To later ages, it is tempting to treat that rebirth as a simple reset. It was not. Mystra did not merely restore what had been. She rewove the weave with a memory of catastrophe threaded into its design. The weave had always been a pathway. Under Maestra, it became also a gate. The most enduring consequence of Karsus's act was not that Netheril fell, empires fall by the dozen across history, but that the rules of magic were narrowed to prevent mortal hands from reaching that same height again. The deep lore records that after Karsus's folly, certain forms of spellcraft were no longer permitted by the structure of the weave itself. The age when Netherese archwizards could treat reality like editable parchment ended in a single generation. To the common folk, this shift was invisible, yet everywhere felt. To wizards, it was a new ceiling. To priests, it was proof that even gods could bleed, and that a god of magic, above all others, would choose the world over herself. And this is where the story becomes darker than rubble. Because in the minds of many who studied the fall, the lesson was not, do not reach. The lesson was, reaching is possible. Karsus had failed catastrophically, but he had also demonstrated a method. A mortal could, through epic magic, touch divinity closely enough to change the world. That knowledge did not die with Netheril. It scattered. Netheril's ruins became a map of temptation. Adventurers, arcanists, and secretive orders began to search for remnants, not only for wealth, but for proof. Proof that the ancient empire had truly been what the legends claimed. Proof that the sky had once belonged to mortals. Proof that the boundary between wizard and god was not a myth, merely a price. Yet the most important truth left in Netheril's dust was simpler and colder. The gods did not destroy Karsus to punish him. The world's magic collapsed because magic, without its divine steward, could not endure a mortal's grasp. So Mystra's first gift to Faerun was not power, but restraint. In the generations that followed, Netheril's name became a kind of taboo, spoken either as a curse or as a promise. The countryside remembered the impact sites as blackened scars. The learned remembered something worse, a moment when the laws of spellcasting proved contingent, held together not by mortal brilliance, but by divine stewardship. Mystra's first reign was defined by an unspoken question that every wizard understood without admitting aloud. If one man had nearly broken magic by taking a god's mantle, what would stop the next prodigy, perhaps wiser, perhaps crueler, perhaps simply luckier, from trying again? So the weave returned with limits written into its bones. After Karsus's folly, the old Netherese heights were no longer reachable in the same way. The spellcraft that had once climbed beyond the bounds later ages would recognize those legendary workings tied to the highest circles of mortal magic became impossible to sustain through Mystra's ordered weave. The ceiling was not philosophical, it was structural. The world itself refused to hold such patterns again. This was the true punishment, and it was not aimed at Karsus alone. It fell on every wizard who came after him. For some, this was mercy. The realms had been spared a future where arch-wizards traded godhood like political offices. For others, it was theft, a new goddess confiscating what their ancestors had proved could be done. Yet Mystra's restraint carried a grim generosity. She was not merely protecting her own divinity. She was protecting the countless lives that depend on magic behaving like an art instead of a disaster. That is the anchor that redefines the whole event. Karsus did not defeat Mystral in the way mortals imagine victory. He forced a moment of substitution so violent that Mystral chose death to keep magic from becoming permanently unmade. The god died to preserve the thing she embodied, and Mystra rebuilt it in a form that could not be seized the same way again. In the ruins, this lesson filtered down through rumor and recovered fragments of scholarship. Some Netherese survivors tried to reclaim pieces of their old craft and found them brittle, unreliable, or outright lethal. A device that once performed faithfully could now fail catastrophically because its assumptions belonged to a dead age. The Empire's relics became haunted by new rules, yet even broken relics teach. Arcanists of later centuries would study Netheril not to rebuild flying cities, few could even imagine the infrastructure, but to understand the boundary Mystra had drawn. And in tracing that boundary, they discovered something unsettling. The gods were not remote abstractions. They were load-bearing. When a god governs a principle, the principle is not merely theirs. It is part of how the world stays coherent. Netheril's fall, then, became more than history. It became doctrine among the wise. Magic was still mighty. Wizards still reshaped battlefields and bent minds and walked unseen through locked doors. But the age of treating reality as a draft to be revised had ended. The weave would carry mortal ambition only so far, and beyond that, it would not merely refuse. It would break, and it would break everyone with it. The hard part of surviving a catastrophe is not enduring the moment it happens. It is living in the world that comes after, where everyone believes they understand the lesson, until the lesson becomes inconvenient. Maestra's limits held. The weave remained stable. Spellcasting returned to a shape mortals could trust again. And slowly, Faerun began to do what it always does after a great wound. It built new lives atop the scar tissue. But there were still people who stared at Netheryl's ruin and did not see warning. They saw inheritance, because the fall of an empire leaves behind more than rubble. It leaves behind systems, forgotten vaults, sealed laboratories, half-buried mythalar chambers, cracked wards still whispering power into the dark. Netheryl's greatest secret was not a single spell or artifact. It was the proof that a mortal civilization had once reached beyond the normal covenant between gods and the world. That proof became bait. Collectors paid fortunes for Netherese scrap. Mages traded favors for fragments of spell formulae. Expeditions vanished into desert sinkholes and never returned. Some came back with little more than scorched bones and haunted eyes. A few returned with relics that should not have survived the change in the weave. Objects so strange they seemed to belong to a different set of laws entirely. And through all of it, one name continued to pull minds like a hook. Karsus. His spell had not merely failed, it had worked. For long enough to kill a goddess. That single fact was an infection in the scholarly imagination. The most disciplined historians wrote of it as tragedy and warning, but among ambitious arcanists, the event became a kind of forbidden syllogism. If the attempt had been possible once, then possibility remained part of the universe's vocabulary, even if Maestra had since censored the grammar. This is where myth begins to grow teeth. Some traditions framed Karsus as a monster who deserved oblivion. Others, especially those born in later eras, far from the impact craters, treated him as a martyr of progress. Neither view fits the contours of what truly happened. Karsus was not a mindless destroyer. He was a prodigy who believed he could solve an existential problem with pure intellect and power, and who did not accept that divinity was a category beyond calculation. That belief is what made him dangerous, and it is also what made him enduring, because even after Mystra rewove the weave, the memory of Mistral's death lingered in divine politics. The gods had watched a mortal grasp the mantle of one of their own. In that instant, divinity had been made vulnerable, not through faith, not through worship, but through mortal spellcraft. That knowledge could not be unlearned. So the response was not only Maestra's, it was the slow tightening of scrutiny. Over time, those who delved too deeply into Netherese lore often found themselves watched by rival mages, by priesthoods, and in the quiet ways the world permits, by forces that did not announce their presence. Not every lost expedition was the result of traps and monsters. Some were the result of secrets that drew attention from beings who preferred those secrets remain buried. And still, the relic hunters kept going. Because the ruins of Netheryl did not simply preserve a fallen empire, they preserved a question that refused to die. What does it mean that the world's greatest magical disaster was caused not by demons, not by dragons, not by ancient curses, but by a mortal who reached up and for a heartbeat pulled a god down into his hands. The most dangerous relic Netheril left behind was not an artifact, it was precedent. Long after the last enclave shattered, arcanists in safer ages began to sift the catastrophe the way surgeons study a fatal wound. They learned quickly that you could not recreate Netherese greatness by copying its tools. Mythalars were not simply machines. They were agreements with the weave as it once was. Under Mystra's reordered laws, those agreements no longer held. That should have been the end of the obsession. Instead, it refined it. If Mystra had rewritten the rules to prevent another Karsus, then the true object of study was no longer Netheril's power. It was Mystra's restraint. Wizards began to ask, quietly, what had actually been changed. Which doors were bricked over? Which corridors still existed but had been narrowed? Which patterns, once possible, now failed not from weakness of the caster, but because reality refused to carry them. In hidden libraries and warded towers, the language changed. The discussion became less about ascending and more about circumventing, not killing a god, but finding the seams where a god's governance could be bypassed. The priesthoods noticed. Temples of Mystra, keepers of a faith that is also an interface with the weave, grew wary of certain kinds of scholarship, not because knowledge was forbidden, but because some questions were no longer innocent after Netheril. A wizard studying spellcraft is ordinary. A wizard studying the exact moment the weave collapsed is something else. It reads like intent. The realms began to develop a kind of immune response. More than one ambitious mage found their research disrupted by rivals who feared the consequences of success. More than one expedition into Netherese ruins returned empty-handed, not because nothing was found, but because what was found was confiscated, hidden, or destroyed by those who considered themselves guardians of the lesson. In some cases, the guardians were not mortal at all. That is the turning point most people miss. The aftermath of Karsus's folly did not end when Mystra rewove the weave. It continued as a long, quiet struggle over who would be allowed to remember how close mortals once came. Because even a failed method teaches. Karsus proved that divinity could be seized through magic. Not bargained for, not granted, but taken. Mystra's laws prevented a repetition in the same form, yet the fact remained carved into history like a scar. Gods were not unreachable. They were simply protected, and protection implies vulnerability. This idea reshaped more than wizardry. It reshaped fear. Nations that once worried about armies and dragons now had a deeper unease. Somewhere, someday, a single mortal might again attempt to rewrite the world's foundations. The spell that killed Mystril became a reference point whenever a mage lord rose too high, whenever a cabal hoarded too much, whenever rumors spoke of lost Netherese workings surfacing in the hands of the reckless. In that climate, Karsus stopped being only a man. He became a symbol used by opposing camps for opposite purposes. To some, his name was the ultimate warning. Brilliance without restraint is a weapon aimed at everyone. To others, he became the patron saint of impossible ambition, proof that the cosmos can be forced to yield. Both readings miss the cruelest truth. Karsus did not fail because the gods were too strong. He failed because the world is not built for a mortal to hold what a god must hold continuously. Divinity is not merely power. It is responsibility embedded into reality, endless, simultaneous, and absolute. Netheril's ruins still glitter with tempting fragments, but the core lesson does not lie in buried vaults. It lies in what happened when the weave fell silent. The moment a mortal tried to wear a god's function, the world itself began to collapse. Because some roles are not crowns to be stolen, but pillars that must never be dropped. In the years after the fall, scholars argued over one detail that refused to fade. The catastrophe did not end with Netheryl's ruins. It rewrote the behavior of magic for everyone who came after. Maestra's first answer to Karsus's folly was not vengeance. It was architecture. The change is remembered as Maestra's ban, a hard ceiling woven into the weave itself, ensuring that mortal spellcraft could not climb into the old Netherrace heights again. In the simplest telling, the outcome is stark. Mortal spellcasting would be bounded to the highest circles now recognized as ninth-level magic, and the reckless upper reaches that Netheryl once treated as attainable were severed from the world's stable practice. To many mages, that limit felt like a door slammed shut. To everyone else, it was a quiet mercy, because the weave was no longer something a single prodigy could seize and fracture in the same way. The realms would still suffer wars, plagues, tyrants, and dragons, but it would not be forced to endure another sudden global silence of magic born from mortal apotheosis. Yet even in the ash, the realms held one more unsettling proof of Netheryl's reach. Not every enclave fell. A small body of Netherrace, those of Thultanthar, later remembered as the City of Shade, escaped the plunge by shifting their entire enclave into the Plane of Shadow shortly before Karsus cast his spell. They did not survive by resisting the collapse of the weave. They survived by stepping aside from the moment of collapse entirely. That single survival changes how the disaster must be understood. Netheryl did not vanish completely in one instant. Its body broke, but a portion of its mind endured, sealed away in darkness, carrying the memory of the old age like an ember kept alive beneath ash. The fall, then, was not only a lesson written in ruins. It was also a lesson carried forward by people who believed they had been right, that only the methods had failed. Here is the truth that deepens the dread. Maestra's ban was not merely the natural consequence of a dead goddess. It was a deliberate safeguard made necessary because a mortal had proven the theft of divinity was feasible in principle. Karsus's success lasted only a heartbeat, but it was long enough to show that the divine mantle could be forced loose. So the realms inherited two truths at once. One, the highest arrogance of Netheryl ended as a cratered epitaph. And two, somewhere beyond ordinary sight, part of Netheryl's lineage persisted, alive, watchful, and shaped by the conviction that the sky once belonged to mortals and could belong to them again, if the right path around Maestra's laws could be found. Thultanthar did not survive by enduring Karsus's folly. It survived by refusing to be present for it. When the weave broke and the sky began to fall, the enclave that would later be called the City of Shade had already slipped into the Plane of Shadow, an act of planning so cold it reads like prophecy in hindsight. While the rest of Netheryl shattered into the earth, the Shadowvar lived on in a dimmer reflection of reality, where sunlight was a memory and time itself felt different at the edges. That exile changed them. In the shadow, survival was not a matter of rebuilding old Netheryl. It was a matter of becoming something the new weave could not easily police. There, the Shadowvar turned toward powers that did not depend on Maestra's repaired order, and they learned to shape magic through darker channels, through secrets, bargains, and the slow seduction of absence. The first revelation is simple. Maestra's bond prevented another Karsus in the same form, but it did not erase the hunger that produced him. In the shadow, that hunger had centuries to ripen without the moderating pressure of the wider world. The second is worse. The memory of Netheryl's peak did not fade for them into legend. It remained personal history, told by living mouths that still remembered the empire's height and treated the fall as a mistake to be corrected, not a warning to be obeyed. They carried names with them, lords and princes whose bloodlines and ambitions stayed intact, while the rest of their civilization became dust. Telemont Tantul, the High Prince, endured as the axis of their identity, a ruler who had saved a city by abandoning a world, and who could not easily believe that sacrifice should end in humility. Within their culture, Karsus's story hardened into a lesson with a sharper edge than the one Faerun learned. The realms below spoke of the folly. A mortal reached too high and destroyed everything. The Shadowvar could not deny the destruction, but many of them held a different conclusion in the dark. The reach was real. A mortal had touched a goddess. The method existed. The failure lay in execution, in target, in timing, details to be solved. That difference in interpretation matters more than any relic. Because once you believe the error was technical, you begin looking for the corrected design. You begin asking whether there are other structures besides the weave, other pathways for power, other patrons who would prefer Maestra's order weakened, not for the good of mortals, but for the advantage of darker divine interests. And so Netheryl's fall did not merely end an empire. It created a diaspora of ideas, some buried in ruins, some preserved in shadow, that continued to press against the boundaries Maestra had rebuilt. The world learned that magic needed a goddess to remain whole. The Shadowvar learned something else, that if magic is governed, then governance can be challenged, patiently, intelligently, and in the right darkness, for as long as it takes. When the City of Shade returned to Faerun, it did not return like a lost nation begging for a home. It returned like a theory re-entering the world to prove itself. For centuries, the Shadowvar had lived under a different sky, in a place where light felt thinner and certainty did not come easily. They learned a kind of magic that the surface world feared because it sounded like a workaround, a way to shape power without relying on the weave as Mystra had rewoven it. The name of that practice did not spread first through taverns or temples. It spread through wizards, because wizards recognize a rival system the way sailors recognize a hidden current. The shadow weave was the closest thing the realms had to an alternative foundation for spellcraft, dark, seductive, and governed by a different divine will. That will was Shar. Here is the revelation that reframes the entire inheritance of Karsus's folly. Netheryl's original crime was not simply that a wizard tried to seize a god's mantle. It was that the Empire assumed there was only one lattice holding magic together, and that by taking the goddess who guided it, they could own the lattice itself. The Shadowvar returned with the opposite assumption. If Maestra's weave had been sealed against mortal overreach, then power had to be pursued through structures Mystra did not fully command. This was not a rebellion announced with banners. It was a quiet shift in methodology. In the lands of Anaurok, where Netheryl's bones already lay under sand, the Shadowvar began to rebuild influence rather than rebuild the old empire outright. They moved through politics, trade, and fear, with a patience that a skyborn empire had never needed. They did not demand worship from the common folk the way gods do. They demanded dependence the way empires do. And then they did what Netheryl at its height always did. They searched for tools. Not merely artifacts, but principles, mythalers, old vaults, living spell formulae, and anything that hinted at how the ancients had climbed beyond mortal limits. Yet every relic they recovered came with a silent test, because Maestra's world was not their old world. Many Netherese works could not be revived cleanly. Some failed. Some lashed out. Some worked only when fed through shadowed channels. That difference mattered more than success or failure, because it taught the Shadowvar a dangerous clarity. Maestra's ban constrained one kind of ascent, but it did not eliminate the human appetite that created it. It simply forced that appetite to evolve, and evolution produces a colder ambition than pride ever did. The Shadowvar's true project was not to repeat Karsus. It was to avoid him, to take the lesson of his collapse and remove the single point of failure, the mortal mind trying to hold the whole weave at once. If magic could be divided, channeled, governed through a darker scaffold, then the reach toward godlike power might be made survivable. In the surface world, most people never saw the theory. They only saw consequences. Shadow-touched nobles, cities leaning into strange alliances, old rivalries sharpened by new, unseen hands. Wizards sensed the deeper shift because they could feel what was changing. The presence of a competing architecture of spellcraft does not stay contained. It pressures the world around it. So the legacy of the spell that killed a god did not remain a story about one catastrophic moment in ancient Netheril. It became a long war of frameworks. Mistra's ordered weave holding the realms together, and Shar's shadowed answer offering power to those willing to trade stability for access. Netheril once fell because it treated magic as property. The Shadowvar returned because they treated magic as strategy. Once the shadow weave entered the living politics of Faerun, the realms faced a danger that did not look like Karsus's folly, but carried the same seed. Because the original catastrophe was not only about one epic spell, it was about a mortal civilization believing it could outgrow the limits that keep the world coherent. The Shadowvar, guided by Shar's shadowed doctrine, pursued the same impulse with better patience and a darker foundation. The struggle that followed was rarely named openly, but its shape was unmistakable to those who understood what was at stake. A contest over the architecture of magic itself. Maestra's weave is not merely a tool set. It is a stabilizing covenant. It permits miracles, but it also keeps miracles from dissolving the world. Shar's shadow weave offered something that felt like liberation to ambitious spellcasters. Power that could slip around Maestra's constraints. Power that did not ask for approval from the same divine order that had slammed the door on Netheril. And in that tension, Karsus's legacy changed again. He ceased to be only a cautionary tale of overreach. He became a reference point for both sides. To Maestra's faithful and to those who valued stability, Karsus was the proof that mortal apotheosis through spellcraft threatens everyone, not only the arrogant. To Shar's adherents and to Shadowvar ideology, Karsus was proof that the divine can be pressured, that the barrier between mortal and God is not sacred, but engineered, and therefore susceptible to sabotage. This is where the story tightens toward its final truth. The spell that killed a god did not just create a limit, it created an arms race. Maestra responded not only with rules, but with vigilance. Her priesthoods guarded lore, monitored dangerous scholarship, and treated certain Netherese fragments not as historical curiosities, but as live ammunition. In the magical community, reputations were shaped by proximity to forbidden research. To be too interested in Karsus was to invite suspicion, not because curiosity itself was crime, but because the realms had already seen what curiosity can become when married to power. Shar's response was subtler. She did not need to outlaw anything. She needed only to offer a path to those who resented being told no. Her power thrives in shadowed places, in loss, in secrecy, in grievance. The Shadow Weave's appeal was never simply strength. It was the promise that the world's limits were negotiable if you were willing to step outside the light. And then a crucial consequence became visible to those who could read it. A divided foundation makes magic less predictable. Even when the weave held, even when Mistra's order remained dominant, the presence of an alternative structure introduced new fault lines, places where spellcraft behaved strangely, where rival paradigms collided, where the same act of magic meant different things depending on which lattice it touched. This did not recreate Karsus's global silence. It created something more insidious: localized instability, political leverage, and a slow corrosion of trust among those who wielded power. Karsus had tried to seize the center of magic in one grasp, and broke the world in a single day. The Shadowvar and Shar threatened to break it by pressure, over time. And that is why the realms could never treat the fall of Netheril as ancient history. The echo of Mistral's death was still alive in policy, in doctrine, in fear. Every major magical conflict after Netheril carried a ghost of that moment. The understanding that if you disturb the foundations, everything built upon them shudders. The spell that killed a god was a heartbeat. Its consequences became an age. In the oldest Netherese fragments, Karsus is sometimes described as if he were a singular madness, an aberration that rose, burned, and vanished, taking an empire with him. That framing is comforting. It allows the realms to believe the danger died in the crater. Canon does not support that comfort. The truth is heavier. Karsus's avatar did not kill Mistral because the gods were careless. It killed her because magic itself could not remain intact under mortal seizure. Maestral's death was a choice made to preserve the very fabric she governed, and Maestra's rebirth was not a restoration of Netheril's freedom. It was a redesign meant to prevent the world from ever again being held hostage by a single wizard's ascent. This is why Maestra's ban matters more than the ruins. It is the scar in the weave that everyone inherits, whether they understand it or not. It is the limit that makes mortal magic reliable, and it is the limit that ensures an empire cannot simply climb into the heavens and declare itself beyond consequence. And yet, the lesson did not end with restraint. Because the spell also proved something no religion had ever wanted proven by mortal hands. Divinity can be forced, not persuaded, not earned through worship. Forced, briefly, catastrophically, but undeniably. That proof did not create more Karsuses overnight. It created a permanent change in the psychology of power. Every arch-wizard who ever looked at the heavens after Netheril lived under a new awareness. The boundary between mortal and God is not only a matter of holiness, it is a matter of structure. The gods are load-bearing for reality, and therefore any attempt to tamper with them is not just sacrilege, it is sabotage. The realms learned to fear that kind of sabotage the way sailors fear a crack in the keel. This is why later movements toward alternative frameworks, like Shar's Shadow Weave and the Shadowvar's Return, felt so threatening even when they did not replicate Karsus's exact crime. They carried the same instinct: to find a way around Mistra's safeguards, to reclaim a version of Netheril's reach without paying Netheril's price. And that, finally, is the full truth uncovered. Netheril fell not because it loved magic too much, but because it treated magic as ownership rather than stewardship. Karsus did not simply attempt to become a god. He attempted to seize the role that keeps spellcraft coherent for everyone. When he did, the world demonstrated what the gods already knew. The foundations of reality cannot be worn like a crown. So the spell that killed a god remains one of the darkest facts in Faerun's history, not because it is sensational, but because it is precise. a mortal mind reached into the mechanism that makes all magic possible. A goddess chose death to keep that mechanism from being destroyed. And ever since, every spell cast in the realms has been shaped by that sacrifice, stable, usable, and bounded, because the world remembers, in the very way it allows magic to exist, what it cost when one man tried to hold the sky in his hands.